That is the typical alternator you would find in a typical RV, van, marine application. As soon as electricity is being generated, we don't only get electricity, we also get heat. And that heat needs to be moved out of the device, otherwise it's gonna burn up. And what they did with these alternators is they added a little fan in here. When you look closely, you can see it spinning. So when it's turning the fan, and that fan moves air through the alternator out of the back here. And whenever there's a big load on this thing and the RPMs are not that high, the engine is not spinning like an idle in a traffic jam, there's not enough air being moved through this thing. And that's where they typically overheat and reduce their output in order to stay cool enough. And that's where these water-cooled alternators come in. This is our Hitachi water-cooled alternator. And it's routing coolant through these connections here, through the whole device, so there's no need for any airflow. It's completely happy at idle, at full output for days, and that's why it makes it an ideal candidate for our van build, because that's what we want. We want to be able to run the air conditioner at idle, right, in a traffic jam, and we also want to be able to charge the battery when maybe just to, run the motor for a half hour or 20 minutes, idle the motor to get some charge back into the battery. And that thing can do that without issues. So there's ways to also manage these alternators better. There's like a system called wake speed, and what it does, it communicates with the BMS and the rest of the vehicle and basically manages this alternator so it never really gets too hot, to avoid this kind of a scenario I described in a traffic jam, overheating. But that's very complicated, and what I don't like is there's no redundancy in that system at all. So if that thing breaks down, we're gonna run out of juice, not only for the back of our RV, but also for the rest of the car, truck. We're not going to be able to start. Well, you know how that goes. And that's why I'm a big proponent of having two alternators. And I have converted several RVs with two alternators. I've never done a water-cooled one before. I've always just added a second air-cooled one, but this build here is the first one with a water-cooled unit. And yeah, it makes it an ideal candidate for what we plan to do. I'm pretty sure it's gonna turn out nice on the long run. So the one issue we noticed is this alternator does not need an excitation connection. Here's an extra terminal where the traditional alternator needs like a cable to receive a signal to generate energy and not. But this one here does not need that. All it takes is a battery connected and to spin, and it's gonna start to produce full power. And we realized that this is a disadvantage for our build, and that therefore I opened this thing up, and it's gonna come in the video, and added a signal line basically so we can control the energy output through a switch on the dash, turn it on and off, because we don't want this to provide full current to our battery and have the BMS basically switch off before it overcharges. That's not an ideal setup, and in the future I want to control this with a with an Arduino device to communicate with the BMS and basically switch that alternator off when it's at 90% charge, in that range. But for now, it's gonna be fine just manually. And yeah, there's always the safety switch of the BMS as well. So we also added a diode in that alternator in order to avoid if the BMS switches off under full load, there's going to be a voltage peak in the wiring, and that could destroy the alternator. And therefore we added a TXV diode, I think TXV. And yeah, let's do it. See you there. And now, last but not least, we're modifying our high performance alternator here, the Hitachi, water-cooled Hitachi 190 amps alternator. And I'm gonna add a remote start for the excitation voltage, because right now, as soon as the battery is connected, the alternator starts producing, and we have no way to disable the charge current until the BMS switches off, which is not ideal because we're going to reach a peak current. And we are also adding this diode here to avoid a voltage peak if the BMS shuts off for whatever reason under full load, and we would get once the inductive field collapses in the wires, it's going to induce such a high voltage it will burn the diodes here. So we're adding this baby. Description in the link. They're very easy and cheap to buy. It just goes from positive to negative here. And yeah, this wire is usually connected to positive. And we're gonna add a switch to that so we can simply turn on and off the alternator. Well, that's the theory. We see if this is going to work or not, but yeah, probability is pretty high. Our diode is wired up, and we got our excitation cable attached. I'm just gonna route it through the opening here in the back.